Hello, my name is John, and I'm a recovering theologian, and I wanted to share a few brief thoughts on reading Soren Kierkegaard as spiritual formation literature. Now, that might strike some as a totally obvious thing to say, because many of us first encountered the Danish literary genius from the 19th century in the context of some kind of spirituality reader. I think the first thing I ever read of Kierkegaard's was in the devotional classics book that Foster put together years ago. Just a small excerpt from that. But for others of us, it may strike as totally bizarre and doesn't connect at all, especially if our first encounter with someone like Kierkegaard was in a philosophy class or something like that. Perhaps reading Truth as Subjectivity, which is an excerpt from the concluding unscientific postscript on the philosophical fragments. And that excerpt appears often in philosophy of religion anthologies. It did in the anthology that I read from when I was in college. And if I hadn't have encountered him in that devotional context first, I think it would have been a lot harder for me to kind of register that he is not a philosopher in the sort of contemporary academic sense of the term. But he certainly is not a writer in spirituality in the kind of contemporary pop Christian bookstore kind of literature either. He's an oddball. He doesn't fit the normal stereotypes of philosopher, theologian, preacher, or mystic. He is very much his own man, which is not a surprise given his own unique genius. So I wanted to say a little bit about how it is that he would be someone that we would engage in, how reading Kierkegaard's works can itself be a means of grace for us if we have eyes to see and ears to hear, as it were. So let me just say a couple of things that have helped me see it that way. I want to focus in first just to give a quick overview, not of his life as much as his works, the kind of basic structure for those who are not familiar. Kierkegaard famously wrote in both under his own name and through a very series of pseudonyms, pen names, false names, which were sort of a, mix between known and unknown secret, even in the early days. But later in his career, it was widely known, and he would often publish under his name as the editor of the works. But he would also publish under his own name, and some of his early works, such as Either or, a two-part series, one kind of written from the perspective of an aesthete, someone who's just seeking pleasure and delight, and then another part written by a moralist, one who's seeking to, live a right and moral life. And then some other texts written, Fear and Trembling, philosophical fragments that are written from a slightly more religious kind of perspective, in the sense of moving beyond merely, aesthetic enjoyment or kind of moralistic do-good, but actually sort of hearing the call of Jesus to a life that is beyond pleasure, but also beyond just regular old moralistic good and evil. So this was kind of an early strategy of his, because he was deeply committed to the notion of indirect communication, something he learned from Socrates, but also is key in his understanding of Jesus as well. That to speak the truth in any time, but especially in the modern world that has had Christianity around it for so long that it sort of takes it for granted, that one has to sort of speak indirectly and speak through these other voices to kind of generate different perspectives and put one on their heels to begin to start defending their own sense of how they live and an openness to kind of seeing an alternative perspective. So this is kind of this indirect or parabolic communication. And as I said, this is crucial then to his Christology because of his understanding that in the event of Christ, in the event of the incarnation of God becoming human, for a human being to stand before you and say, I am the Son of God, right? Even if he's speaking directly, straightforwardly, not in parables, that just is a parable or an indirect communication, because it's not a god in front of you. It's a man. It's a human being. So it's a human being speaking as the divine being is already an indirect kind of communication that actually is an offense or a scandal. It drives you to the question of faith. How will you respond? And it's not faith just as the conclusion of a syllogism, a set of arguments, right? But faith as a moment of encounter with Jesus Christ and responding to his call. And so Kierkegaard in many ways took it as his mission in life that we would in fact hear the call of Christ, the lived Christianity in all its seriousness. And this is part of another reason why he writes in these indirect communications, especially in his later life as he starts to write under like a new pseudonym, Anticlimacus, who is the author of Practice in Christianity, one of my favorite books, and the one I am currently assigning in the Demon in Spiritual Formation, for whom this video is primarily but not exclusively intended. The Practice of Christianity is written by Anticlimacus, who he says is one who is going to present the ideal of Christianity at its furthest extreme, right? Taking it as utterly seriously as possible, right? Not introducing all the sorts of qualifications that make the life of the Christian more bearable, right? Because one bears one's cross, but one also has to bear one's job and vocation in life. And there's a lot of literature out there, a lot of Christian teaching on how to juggle all of it. And Kierkegaard is interestingly very, as himself, has a certain kind of sympathy and understanding for that reality. But he says we too quickly hide behind that. And so he doesn't want to present himself as like, I'm the real Christian. So by adopting this pseudonym, he's able to kind of say, here's someone who is in the voice of one speaking as a radical Christian who really believes it, is going to present the call of Christ as seriously as it can be in all of its offense. Blessed is he that does not take offense at me. I mean, he starts with, in the Practice of Christianity, which has these three main parts. It starts in the first third around the phrase, come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. And it's this wonderful invitation. And yet even that invitation is an offense, because it is to him that you must come to experience the rest, not just a way of life, but a way with the one who is the way, the truth, and the life. Come to me, and you will find rest. And then in the second part, there's the exploration of blessed is he who does not take offense at me, exploring the nature of the utter offense that God would take on human flesh, a sort of historical fact that we can kind of just take for granted. And that Kierkegaard wants to press us into sort of being shocked by it again, to place us in the position of contemporaneousness, right? Not in the sense of just historically going back there, but encountering Jesus in our own contemporary life and feeling the shock of it all, right? But that includes having a certain attunement to what it would have been like to really encounter Jesus, right? And it wouldn't have been so obvious that this man standing before you is God in the flesh, right? So he really wants the incarnation to capture our imagination and shake us up to our core, to say, do you really wish to follow this man? And then the third and last is the third and last part of Practicing Christianity is a series of sermons, all on the same text, but kind of taking it from different angles. From the famous line in John 7, when I am lifted up, I will draw all to myself, right? And he explores what it means for him to be lifted up, right? Which sounds like, he's exalted, yes, but it's Christ in his abasement, Christ in his humility, saying this, that when I am lifted up, I will draw to himself. So what does it mean to be drawn to Christ in both his glory and his shame, both his exaltation and his humility, right? And so it's this radical call to meet Christ in lowliness, which is the only place we can truly encounter him. And of course, it has my favorite passage in Kierkegaard, which comes towards the end of that book, which is when he talks about how Christ is not seeking adorers, but followers. Now, that may be more starkly put. I do even wonder if Kierkegaard had a place for adoration of Christ in his thought. I'm still sorting that out for myself, but notice what I'm doing there. I'm trying to kind of create a dialectic that brings them together, right? And he just radically kind of sees it. Christ is looking for followers. Come follow me, right? Um, Follow me in my abasement, right? Don't just stand at a distance in my exaltation and be amazed at how great I am. Follow me into into the glory which is through and in my suffering. So why is all this spirituality? Well, of course, it's about Jesus. So anything about Jesus can be spiritually uplifting. But furthermore, more importantly, though, not more importantly, I should say, but more specific to Kierkegaard, I think that is the most important thing. I think actually any kind of Christological literature can be read as a means of grace and as transforming reading. Um, but Kierkegaard has a special place in the, for lack of a better term, the canon of Christian spirituality, because he, perhaps more than any other voice, helps to articulate a kind of radical, singular address to each individual. Now, it's common to critique Kierkegaard for a kind of individualism, and maybe that critique sticks. I'm less convinced now than I was maybe 5-10 years ago when I just sort of accepted that as, because it's kind of the common wisdom of our time. I started kind of pushing against that as I'm reading. I don't really think all intense focus on individuality is necessarily individualism, if that distinction makes sense. It's not that Kierkegaard was against the dependence that we have on the community in our Christian life. I don't actually think that was what he was rejecting. I think more than what he was trying to press at is that when Christ calls us, he addresses us in our individuality, not only in our individuality, right? But there is a hard saying, there is a hard call, and there is something about how our life in society and even in Christian communities, in their distortion, can make us fall into being just a member of the crowd, right? See this connection back to adoration and versus followers, adorers versus followers. I mean, you got to admit that a lot of Christian discipleship can slip into being a part of a Christian crowd. And when you think of the role of the crowds in the Gospels, it can kind of help you to start to see that a guy like Kierkegaard is sort of helping us see what it means to be in a crowd, but not of the crowd, as it were, right? To be in the crowd, but to hear Christ addressing you, right? And this is especially crucial for pastors and leaders who are leading communities and are experiencing an invitation to deeper spiritual journey, deeper spiritual formation. It can be very tempting to want to quickly figure out how to repackage this for my community. Now, don't get me wrong, we have a role to play as shepherds in our communities. But at the same time, I think it's important to let Kierkegaard help us to be summoned out of the crowd by Christ himself. And if reading Kierkegaard can be an opportunity for Christ to look you in the eye again and call you towards himself and into co-suffering with him, then I think Kierkegaard will prove to be a means of grace, whatever his intentions and whatever his own doctrine, though I think his intentions are quite worthwhile and his doctrine has much to teach us. At the very least, reading his works can be an opportunity to hear Christ's invitation to you in and amidst the community and the world. Okay, I hope that helps. Just wanted to float that out and see if that's helpful to you in your reading of Kierkegaard. Be sure to like and subscribe, because you always got to throw that on a YouTube video. And don't forget to check out Fresh Text on all your major podcast apps. That's Fresh Text for weekly updates and commentary on Scripture. All right, bye-bye.